talk is going to try to do two things. Talk up towards the urban expansion chapter as well as the housing and shelter chapter. And as we were discussing earlier, they're linked. This is why I do research on both. And there'll be quite a different things that I'm showing you, but the overarching agenda is to see our cities better, that we've been blind to a large segment of the population, primarily migrants, who are the source, who is why the cities are so big, and that we can learn a lot from recovering information about them that can inform our public policies. So trying to see our cities better is what's in common with both of them. And for the first time in human history, the majority of the world's population is living in cities, and that has primarily come from movement. People moving to cities in search of economic opportunity, primarily. And what that's set up, though, is a common global dynamic I'm coming to understand is migrants' legitimacy to be there is contested here in the United States and Europe right now with Syrian refugees, all over the world. But they're physically there, here. And it's making our cities denser than they've ever been before. So that's what I call the spatial challenge. You know, how can we all live together? And what we kept coming across is it's both a technical, physical problem as well as a political issue. Several of your previous guest speakers have talked about is the potential of using satellite imagery. And I happened upon this when I was a doctoral student because I was working in Vietnam, where it's challenging to get data for a number of reasons, because it doesn't exist, but also the bureaucratic hurdles of trying to get permission for any of this kind of stuff. And so sort of as a backup to my dissertation fieldwork, I commissioned satellite photos, because that way I knew I could get something. And what's fascinating is that these satellite images have been going on for a long time, primarily because of spying, but these have been declassified, and they are the only historic record of what was happening on the ground in some instances, right, of these times. And so you can recover situations of the recent past with satellite imagery if you could get a clear cloud-free image. Also, what's nice is a lot of times when you try to get land use information, it's spotty. You get certain parts of the city where there might have been a development project with more detail than you have in other areas. With satellite imagery, it's a photo of the entire urban area. And what's nice, as I was saying, is it's commercially available. I could just buy it from Spot Image. I didn't need all these approvals to get it. They've really been expanding in what's available. You know, when I first got these images, wow, now it's 15 years ago, you know, I got 10-meter resolution. They're down to, 1 meter. You can see a lot now with different kinds of resolution. And we've been increasing our ability to use these images. A lot of scholars are working on how to interpret this satellite imagery for land uses. But as we have to study it because there's a lot of challenges with trying to use it. So some of the issues are that, for example, I said you could recover the past, but for example, Vietnam is in a tropical area. There's often clouds in the sky. So when I scoured the databases through the 90s for my specific part, which is the city area, I only could find 3 images that were cloud-free, right? So there's challenges for that from that vendor. Years of coverage, the resolution of the imagery, you have to choose. If you choose higher resolution, you'll see different things than you can with lower resolution, of course. So this issue of standardizing what we're claiming is urban needs to be sorted out. Also, these places are very different. And so, essentially with satellite imagery, it's recording how much reflection is coming back from the Earth. And you have different geological conditions, wetter areas, drier areas, and then different seasons throughout the summer. We'll see a big variation with the 3 cloud-free images I got. One was during the dry season, one was during the wet season. So you have to adjust your algorithms for the different bandwidths of what information you're getting. And then, what we're trying to interpret from these satellite imagery are urban built patterns, and the building typology, the kinds of materials that are used, and therefore the shininess of what's reflected back is going to be different from one city to the next in different parts of the world. And so again, you really need to contextualize and customize the interpretation to specific places. And my interest is to recover information about more informal kinds of urban development. And with satellite imagery, we can only see the physical. So a lot of informal construction has a certain kind of pattern, which is what we're detecting, but it doesn't say anything about the tenure status. So you can have formal-looking buildings that are officially informal because they don't have the proper papers. So we have to be careful about what we're insinuating from the built environment. And then there's a number of ways we could try to interpret the imagery, which is the main point of what I'm presenting, as I know you're interested in how might we have a global view of urban expansion. Given such heterogeneous conditions, we have to think about setting some standards of how we do this so that we can compare across places. So let me give you a specific example, which it's a nice happenstance. This work that I did was in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, the largest city in Vietnam that has grown very rapidly. And as I said, I commissioned those satellite images in 2000, 2001. And since then, 2 other groups of scholars have used satellite imagery and interpreted the same area for the same time period. So what I'm going to show you is a comparison of 3 different studies trying to do essentially the same thing and how we came up with different results to further emphasize this discussion about it's complicated to try to make some kind of standard norm. And there's a lot of scholars working on different kinds of classification systems. And so what we're calling for is to make a more transparent, open discussion about the way we, the methods we choose, how we're reporting it, so that we can have a better discussion across studies. So let me show you an example. So to give you a sense of the kinds of land use changes I'm talking about, these are photos I took on the periphery of Ho Chi Minh City. So again, it's a pretty wet area, particularly on the southern side of the city, where farming was done, but some informal construction has also happened on the periphery. And then there's more formal construction like this on the right. So you have a lot of different conditions going on in Ho Chi Minh City. And as I said, satellite imagery is just recording the kind of brightness value of that reflection. And so these are the 4 years images that I use for my study, 1991, 94, 98, and 2001. These are all of the same area. You could see this road coming down, and darker is wetter areas, and the white bright one is concrete, essentially being reflected back. And you could see changes between these areas. So for example, you could see this new development here, a road going to a land use that wasn't there in 98. So with these images, you can start to track developments that happen over time. What's also nice, I was lucky that these were relatively evenly spaced out over time. You can leverage policy changes that happen. So the Vietnamese economy started opening up in 1989. There's a big land law that was issued in 1993 that for the first time allowed private land use rights, which helped spur construction. And then there's rapid growth over time. So that's what I was working on. And what I developed was fine-tuning the algorithm, knowing the context of Ho Chi Minh City. So the issue is that while it's easy to detect things like this, right? There's a big distinction in brightness value. Also, it's a pretty large area, and kind of geometric shape. But there's these kinds of areas that are a little, dim, but it looks like there's something there. You could see it with your eye. So what I had done was be there on the ground, hike out and say, yep, that's a hut, right? It's ground truthing to see, test what these images are picking up. And with that, we could develop an algorithm that's supervised classification, leverage with my ground truthing, right? So we kept trying to fine-tune the algorithm to record what we know for sure is construction on the ground. And essentially what we were contributing is, in the past, experts would set kind of a break off brightness value above which it must be urban. It's so bright, right? And then anything below that, the cutoff point was not urban, right? But what we're saying is, well, if you incorporate texture, essentially what our eyeball just did, saying, I could see that there's something there, and how do we define that computationally? If we did add the texture with the brightness value, we covered back some portion that we call is also urban, which be ground truth and confirmed. And essentially a lot of those are informal settlements, because what they're building with are less shiny things, right? Not like less hot things than concrete. So this was the satellite image that I bought, and we'll keep seeing Ho Chi Minh City. So to orient yourself, here's the major river that snakes through the side. This is the downtown. You can see the airport here, okay? So so as you saw, the 1991 image was much darker than the other year's images, again, because of seasonal changes. And so we had to adapt each year's algorithm to that particular spectrum of brightness value. So it automates it. It detects what is urban. So we did it for 98, for example, and 2001. And if you see the difference, then that is what has changed between the 2 years. And so to get a broader picture, this is 1994. This is 2001. Red is formal urban, the bright concrete. So you can see a massive amount of expansion in a very short period of time, 7 years, in Ho Chi Minh City, right? And what I was most interested, though, which doesn't show up well in this zoomed out version, is yellow, the what I'm calling informal urban, informal construction, the less shiny stuff that we covered back. And that's what I was interested in, because, again, those might be the populations we're especially interested to know about as urban planners. They are often in low-lying areas, more vulnerable to natural disasters. We could see if they are within the infrastructure lines, are they within the urban boundaries, et cetera. So we're really curious about recovering that information. So as I said, we did that study in 2004 and published it. And since then, 2 other groups have studied Ho Chi Minh City at almost the same time period. One was the same year 2000, another one was 2001. But we did it in slightly different ways and came out with different results. So here's my study. We used 10-meter resolution imagery, spot image, became commercially available. Solly Angel, who's just here, he's been doing interpretation around the world, and he did Ho Chi Minh City as well using 30-meter resolution. The World Bank, for its East Asia urbanization competition, luckily chose Ho Chi Minh City as one of, I think, something like 5 cities where they had more detailed data at 30-meter resolution, and actually had commissioned a group at University of Wisconsin-Madison to do interpretation of it, or classification of it, and they also used 30-meter. We both, all of us, do some amount of unsupervised classification, just choosing, with algorithm, certain brightness level. What was different between us is I don't know as much detail about how Angel and his group supervised it, but they said they went back and didn't just rest on the algorithm, had some other information they incorporated into the classification, and as I told you, ours was based on field work. And there's a lot of literature of other people who have been doing classification in other places, including the Global South, different methodologies, different resolution images, et cetera. And what's clear from that literature review is there is no single approach that is the right one to use for everywhere around the world, which makes sense given what I told you about very heterogeneous conditions, right? And so you're always having to make trade-offs on what you're going to detect and classify and what is going to be error or give up, right? As we do with statistics, with anything. And what's nice is a lot of the, some of the studies report error and how accurate they were, but others do not. So I think that's one thing that needs to be developed as a norm for these studies is reporting your error. It's also important what kinds of spatial conditions your algorithm privileges. So here is a comparison of our 3 studies. So let me explain it to you a little bit. Red is what all 3 studies classified as urban. So you can see there's a lot of agreement between the 3 of us. The bulk of the downtown area is urban and unambiguously. In this lavender shade is areas that only the World Bank classified as urban. So they classified a lot more area than Angel or I did. Angel and I actually both had similar amounts of land area that we classified as urban. The World Bank classified 10% more than us. And you can see it's mostly in this northern area, which is the drier part of Ho Chi Minh City, right? So this is the swampier part over here. In yellow is areas that only I classified as urban. And as you can see, most of it is on the periphery and more on the southern side where it's wetter. You can also see the World Bank got more of the major roads than we did, right? And then in orange are areas that only Angel had classified as urban. Also, on the periphery, different parts of the periphery, it seems to be closer to the roads is what I could surmise just from looking at this picture. So you can see we're detecting different parts as urban. And I think the big takeaway point with this is because I was walking out there and ground truthing it, I was making sure we got these kinds of informal settlements, right? And that was important for the purposes of my study. So here again is some metrics of comparison. Angel and I classified somewhere between 22 to 23% of the study area as urban. And the bank classified 34% as urban, right? The classification typologies that we set up were different. So at least in this past study, Angel just said urban or not urban, whereas I distinguished between urban formal and urban informal because that was the portion I was trying to recover with the algorithm, right? The World Bank for this East Asia urbanization report had even more classes, and what they called it is urban continuous, urban discontinuous but high density, urban discontinuous low density, which I think you can say is probably the informal kinds of patterns that I was looking for, as well as non-urban and water. So there's relative strengths in what we came up with. The World Bank definitely got more of the roads and maybe more informal settlements. You know, there's some patchy parts in the northern part in drier areas. Angel didn't really say formal, informal, but it looked like the parts that where he only got was maybe more informal type settlements along roads. And I got more of the informal settlements in risk-prone areas, which is important. These distinctions have policy implications, right, of what we're saying is urban, where are areas that are populated. So this is just looking at my data. We looked at if we put a buffer along waterways, there's a lot of off-the-river canals and tributaries. If we put a buffer around those waterways, how much of what we detected is in that buffer? And we also did a similar thing along roads. How much of what I detected as informal was near a road? And so you could see that a lot of what we were classifying as informal was in the waterway region, right? So that can have policy implications about if you're worried about climate change and flooding, and or if you have the infrastructure alliance information, who is where and what is their situation. So we're working on a paper thinking about this more largely to address this community of scholars who are trying to improve our classification of satellite imagery. And because I think one of my agendas is with our moment in urban expansion to include migrants and more informal settlements. And in order to do that, you really need to ground truth to see what that means in a particular place. What is the kind of housing situation and what would it look like? And then if we want to do global comparisons of cities around the world, we need to develop some kind of standards and protocols to do that well. And so I want to promote with this paper a discussion about integrating these various disparate studies who are doing these things in different ways, about what we have learned to contextualize classification for different kinds of geographic conditions, seasonal conditions, as well as a kind of standard way to report error. It's been spotty across studies. And it seems like the sensible thing to do is to establish a baseline way of interpreting imagery and classifying it for particular places and track those changes over time in order to see change. So that's one project that I'm working on. Now shifting to the second part of the talk, which is housing and shelter. So as I said, there's been a lot of migration to cities. Cities are expanding, but where are these people living in the cities? And what is the housing situation? A lot of that expansion is coming because people's bodies have moved there and they need places to live. And that's a lot of the construction. And I always like to contextualize what's going on in the global south with the moment in other places around the world. This is Jacob Reese's photos in New York at U.S.'s time of rapid urbanization at the turn of the 19th century. And this is underground basement housing of migrants crowding, because I'm going to show you my Beijing work. It sometimes seems so extraordinary. It's got a lot of media attention, but it almost can seem like a freak show of China, and I just want to normalize this might be actually a regular condition of rapid urbanization of migrants eking out a place to live in the city. These are images from Hong Kong, which are some of the highest densities in the world, 3.7 square meters per person. And again, this is even denser than what I'm going to show you in Beijing. And it's happening in high-price countries. You probably see Tokyo's capsule rooms where workers who got unemployed or can't afford the commute time were regularly sleeping in these as monthly rentals. Mexico City is starting to vision a whole underground city because they're running out of space. So they talked about earth scrapers building down. Singapore is actually building down because they have very limited land, and they've reclaimed a lot from the ocean already, but another way to exploit is to go down. So they're having national research agenda to how to better exploit the underground. When land values are high enough, it can support this kind of expensive engineering and construction. So I'm going to show you two housing markets that exemplify the extraordinary lengths at which migrants want to live in the city. And so the first study focuses on Beijing's subterranean housing market. So Beijing is a large city with roughly 23 million people in the larger metropolitan area, and by some estimates there's roughly 1 million people living underground. So these orange dots are where we geocoded underground apartments in Beijing, and as you can see, it's well distributed in the city. This is the Forbidden City, and it has a series of ring roads that go out. And so I was stunned to learn about this phenomenon from one of my students, and I spent a sabbatical year in Beijing and explored this more deeply. We all know that Chinese cities have done an incredible amount of construction above ground. What a lot of people don't know is in several cities, particularly in the arid northeast like Beijing, there's also been, by code, a policy to build underground space under every building for bomb shelters and what they call common basements. So all that building above ground has also a huge underground layer throughout the city. And this one that I visited, there's a little entrance here to the air raid shelter, but it connects to the basements of two surrounding buildings. And so they could walk through if the doors were open. And what has happened is that given the lack of housing, particularly in the 1980s, as Chinese cities grew very rapidly, there was actually a government policy that encouraged people to exploit this military space for during peacetime. And you could subdivide these into apartments and get building use permits for that, as well as shops, as well as a number of other uses. And so what happened is these got subdivided into little apartments. That was encouraged until about 2011 when the policy was reversed, and now they want these spaces to be vacated. And so, but this is again one of the case study places I went to that I was telling you about. Above here was a playground, and people who are underground, often in good weather, would hang out above ground. You enter buildings like this. They're everywhere once you realize this is going on. Those little blue and green signs actually are translated in English. You can see exactly. There's different types of spaces. Here's the airlock door that you step through to get to your room. And people are using the hallway sometimes to do other things. It can get humid because of ventilation issues, but they were actually built to code. I got the design guidelines, so there's water connection, electricity, air ventilation shafts, 3 exits out for fire safety, etc. So what I was amazed to find was there's a whole online market for these apartments. And so they have an incredible amount of information, including their location in the city, the rental price, the kinds of amenities they have, etc. So we scrape this data from the largest classified ads online ad website for 1 year, and geocoded the data and ran a hedonic price model to study the nature characteristic of this market. So you can start to see some of the ads here and the photos. So one thing we realize is these are probably going to be on the nicer end of underground apartments if they can so openly advertise and show photos. So we're trying to gauge what subset of the housing market is this. So with our data, we found that the average unit was 10 square meters, which is just enough space for a twin bed and for you to walk in next to it, right? And the rent was $71 or 448 yen in Chinese currency, to give you start to get a handle on this. It's also helpful to know, given there have been a few studies, previous studies of underground apartments. They have their different strengths and weaknesses. So the some covered just certain parts of the city, some did cluster sampling. But what that helped to gauge was, where is my particular source relative to what else are underground housing units out there. So the median rental price seems to be on the higher end of previous studies' findings, and correspondingly a little larger. I think it's also helpful, to think about these metrics of livability given the context of Beijing. So the standards for space have been evolving with policy over time, right? So as I said, it was actually encouraged to use this space, including for housing, but then there's reversal announced in 2010, implemented in 2011. What's the minimum size per person has been changing and under debate as well. So it used to be 4 square meters a person, and now it's 10 square meters. And the Tsinghua study that looked at different kinds of migrant housing advocated for a standard of 5 square meters. So one of the things that was helpful with that study is they studied different migrant housing options. So actually, if we say there was roughly 1 million units of underground housing in the center city, the Beijing Municipal Institute of Planning and Design estimates 4 million residents on the periphery. So you can see that there's different kinds of housing submarkets. And those can be much smaller and cheaper. So the average size they found was 6 square meters for being on the periphery in urban village housing. And that's essentially like worker dormitory housing, where you get 6 square meters because you have a bunch of people in one long room, right? And the people that we talked to wanted this different kind of choice because, for example, if you want more privacy, if you have a spouse and you want more privacy together, if you want, the urban villages are known for having more crime, so some preferred being in the inner city. Most of these have a property manager / guard at the doorway if it seemed more secure to them than being in the urban village. So as I said, they're distributed throughout the city. I think what's helpful to think about is to compare them with public housing projects, which around the world tend to be built on the periphery because land is cheaper as a construction project. But you see this big contrast between what this underground housing market is offering and what the public housing programs are doing. It's an apple and orange comparison because the public housing programs have been only for people with hukou, the right to reside in the city. And these we found through our interviews were primarily migrants who don't have hukou. So these public housing projects are not even an option for them. More recently, the Chinese government is starting some migrant housing projects, but they're for high-skilled, high-educated workers that they want to have in the city, such as people in high-tech industries. So in addition to looking at where they're located, we ran a hedonic price model to see the kinds of preferences, housing preferences, the trade-offs that people are making between different housing attributes. So, before I do that, I had descriptive statistics. Okay, so I think one thing to note is not all the underground housing were completely underground. So window, no window means there's also the type of underground housing that in Boston is euphemistically called garden apartment, where you have a little sliver of a window at the ceiling. And so there's a half of those in these market, right? So we could test for what value is it having, not being that underground and having a little bit of window versus not. We also wanted to test for seasons because we were hearing through the press and conventional wisdom that, for example, a lot of people go back to their hometown during the Lunar New Year and are there for maybe a month or more. And so, they might leave these apartments. Another is there's this tradition, especially in Beijing, of young students coming to study near the great universities because they think it'll help their college entrance exam scores. So there's a big influx of people looking for housing in the months leading up to the exam time. So these are the median monthly rents, and there seemed to be somewhat of a cycle. We're lucky that it happened that we started and ended at a time that was up spike, because we could have seen maybe general appreciation over time. But Lunar New Year's around here, January, February, right? And then the exam period, I forgot now, I think it's September. Maybe some people know. It's in my paper. So we ran the hedonic price model, and the preferred model is here. So it behaves just like a regular housing market. The more space you have, the higher the rent. The closer you are to the city center, the higher the rent. So the sign is in the opposite direction, how far you are away from the city center. How close you are to transportation access is also would raise your rent. So the farther you are away, the lower your rent would be. These are, the dependent variable was the natural log of monthly rent prices. So you could say the percentage impact of these attributes on that. So in other words, for each square meter area increase of your unit, you could have 3.9%, you'd have to pay 3.9% higher rent, monthly rent. And so if you're 1 kilometer closer to the city center, you'd pay 4.3% more for rent, etc. So what's helpful is to gauge the value of having a window relative to these other things. How much are they willing to trade off on being underground? So the first thing to notice is it's always negative. You would rather have a window. You'd rather not live underground, right? But the weight of it is 3.9% relative to these other attributes, right? So it's significant, but there's other things they're trading off with, right? And then the number of subways. So if you're in more of a hub, has a much bigger increase in rent. And what I'll foreshadow what we find later is it's not because they're taking the subway. Almost no one takes the subway to work. The reason then, how to interpret this, is that's where the jobs are or amenities are. And so they want to be near those hubs. But most of them are walking or biking to work. Right? So they're not paying, they don't have a willingness to pay for the subway. And then there are a bunch of other amenities that we could look at. So, I think we should learn from the revealed preferences of this migrant population to help inform the kinds of housing that they're expressing a demand for. by their locating in the underground, they're very strongly saying all the attributes associated with being in the city center is more important to me than I'm willing to live underground. And that's a big pushback to the way we think about or operationalize public housing projects, which you can understand is a costly construction project, so you're trying to economize and build as many units as you can, but they're often in places where people don't want to live, right? And that demand is expressed very strongly here. Let me move ahead. So we also, in addition to looking at market data remotely, we went and talked to people living underground, as well as the property managers, as well as the people living above them, because we wondered about the situation, governance-wise, socially, et cetera. And so I had a team of Chinese students who went out to different areas of Beijing. And I'll just, one of the things we wanted to see is what are the living conditions underground. No one had done a systematic study of what are the living conditions underground. So again, the Beijing Municipal Institute of Planning and Design said this would be helpful to them because they're trying to wrap their heads around it as well. And so we just start to develop ways of thinking about the metric. And so we, this is more for discussion than proposing anything specific, especially since now you're not supposed to live underground. But to gauge the conditions, we created categories partly based on what are the codes. So, if they went against safety codes, then they were unlivable, unsafe, right? If they had just those basic characteristics, but nothing else, then they were basic safety. Then we said adequate if they had other kinds of attributes. And then what was surprising is that to think that there might actually be a healthy and livable underground space. And I think that's the biggest thing that evolved for me, because before going to Beijing, and I think a lot of people, they're referred to as the rat population, right? You're thinking the most awful things of what it must look like, and there are some like that. But I think what was surprising to us, and I'll show you photos, is ones that kind of question, is a provocative question that this might be a livable housing option. Oh, so of those that we went and visited, we graded them, and we found a variety of types. So this was the worst one that was underground. I don't think it was a worker, kind of janitor who worked in that building, and we found situations like this where it's just not enough space. This is very dangerous, where there's no protection from rain coming down into the underground. And then these are some of our best ones. There's actually a little window. It's clean. There's roughly amount of space. This is, again, with an elevated entrance to block flooding. There are kitchen facilities, shared kitchen facilities, shared bathroom and shower facilities. Here's another entrance to the underground. And so, in the paper I lay out, what are some of the standards? And they've been changing. So, for example, when I was a visiting professor at Peking University, the students who were working on this said, that's actually more space than we get in our dorms, right? And they all have to take showers in one central shower house on campus. They have to walk across campus and share. And in the Hutong neighbors, there's also communal bathrooms. So it's kind of recalibrating what the standards are. But China's recalibrating too, because the students were up in arms that sharing one room with 4 people was unlivable. Especially when they see the foreign dormitories where you have a living room and you, but the professors, who are older said, well, it used to be 10 people per room, and then it became 8 people, and then 6 people, and 4 people. So what the standards are have been evolving, right? Okay. The other question is who's living there, and so lot of things dropped out. Oh, okay. What again was interesting, as I said, it's probably on the higher end of underground housing, but we found both blue-collar and white-collar workers living underground. They could include people working in IT companies, an interior decorator, etc. Right? So this helped to, again, kind of broaden the range of what's happening in the underground and who's living down there, even though they've been kind of othered as rats. Right? One of the things we asked was how do they, where do they work, what's their commuting time like, and what's their mode? And the largest group walked to work within 15 minutes. So as I said, no one was using the subway, right? Okay, please. And so, one of the things I realized by the end was that there really needs to be policy addressing the situation. In Beijing, there could be, roughly 30%, 25 to 30% of the population are people without hukou, migrants. And some are, highly skilled and they could get their hukou changed by their employer, but others are lower skilled. And they are, as the job showed, they're your waitresses, they're your store clerks, they're people all around us, right? But I could see that there's this tension about how long can the situation last politically. So we interviewed people and they're really talking about a hope deferred. They're hoping for the next generation, or this is my starting out period and we're hoping for better. That's why we're living, like this. And so, the more recent policies have been to start to address migrant housing issues. But at the same time, as there's been this kind of eviction from the underground, there's been continual demolition of urban villages on the periphery. So it's unclear where these people are supposed to live. So in summary, we find that some underground housing is not the lowest housing and quality, price and quality option. That would be in the urban villages, actually. There's a variety of housing conditions underground, from terrible to livable. And what this whole market is showing is the need for rental housing, right? That they cannot buy, and but they still want to be in the city. And there also needs to be, the migrant housing needs to be addressed. And what the hedonic price model shows is for some subset of that population, they are expressing a very high preference to be in the city center. Right? They've made that trade-off, that it's worth it to be underground. And finally, that people underground who are normal. So I'm not sure if this one's going to play either. This does not show up either. I have to work on that technical issue. But what this video would show is following one person coming out of her underground unit, going up the 2 flights of stairs, and then at her workplace, and we zoom out and see she's just blends in as a regular person. And we do these visualization works to help narrate what we're talking about and to break down the othering of the rat population. Okay, the second project is related and it's more in progress, but we thought, we heard there's underground housing in Shanghai too, so we went to go look there, but we actually didn't find that, but we found something else, which I'm still not sure how to term it. I'm calling it overcrowded housing, but it's really a global issue where many people are sharing an apartment more than it was designed for. And the market is to rent a bed in a room, an apartment full of beds. And so there's a much huger online market for that market. And again, we were amazed to find an online market with rich information. And here we used a website that has some interesting characteristics. So even in that 1 year, 2 year span since the Beijing study, There's advances in that they already geocoded all the locations, latitude, longitude of all these ads, which has cut down our work a lot. But also it had interesting pieces of information for study. So again, we could see the price and different characteristics. One of the things that was most interesting to me is they mentioned gender. So there's a category that posters of ads can put in, whether this is a rental unit just for women. And then it could be possible to price gender for migrant housing, right? Do they have to pay more? Do they have to pay less? So I'm really eager to see the results of that, which we don't have yet. We're just starting to test out the scraping and gather it together, and we'll be collecting it for 1 year. But what else it tells us is how many people are in the bedroom that you're sharing with. So whether it's a room with 2 beds in it, 4 beds in it, 6, 8, or 10, right? So really, we have to do the hedonic price model in a different way. It's not the monthly rent to be in the apartment. We have to also, we can put in a level for interior density, right? How much space you get inside the apartment. So we've started mapping it, and Shanghai is turning out to be different. It's not so monocentric. We're going to have to, I'm realizing, find polycentric nodes to better model land values. But here's some initial descriptive statistics. So, with our one initial month of scraping and cleaning out the data, the initial scrape was 3,000, and we threw out many to be on the conservative side. But most of them seem to be a situation where you're sharing a room with 4 to 8 people. And so these are the percentage of ads that we found. Also, the market appears to be pricing rationally, as you would expect. So the less crowded the room is, the more you pay, right? So for 2 people in a room, this is how much you would pay for your bed. 4 people in a room, 6 people in a room, 8 people in a room. And so, giving rough figures, so we can't always tell how many people are in the apartment, but we know that on median, most of the apartments have 3 bedrooms. So it's in the range of, roughly 18 people per apartment in this market. What's also fascinating is in addition to studying the demand side of the market, the sellers, the posters of the ads, are saying what they're looking for in a renter. And so they are showing who they're imagining they're targeting, right? And essentially they're looking for young, educated people. So if you're looking for a job or you're currently employed, you're a student, if you're young, they don't want anyone over 35. I wouldn't qualify. White-collar workers, if you have your ID, et cetera. And they list a number of unwanted traits, like if you're a drinker or loud and things like that. So that's fascinating. And as I said, they have this category of gender. So we're going to go there this summer to explore this further, because we don't know if the default is co-ed or how to understand when they do say it's female only. We also need to know better the structure of the market. So what's the typical term? How long do people rent for? How often should we check that they are being let out again, et cetera. So that's what we plan to do going forward, and I look forward to those results. So if we thought about both housing studies together, I think they have several implications that would be helpful as we think about policy going forward. Coming to face with the empirical reality that millions of migrants are already in the city, and they're finding a way to live there. And to deal with that reality, know where they are, what's going on, what are the conditions. We were talking earlier about, I've been in master planning jury competitions where it's these kind of heroic, glossy architecture visions of the city with nobody in it, right? And a lot of times when they have pedestrian types of images, it's for what Florida would call the creative class, people in twos shopping in a park or something like that. So there's other things going on in the city that we should be planning for because they're already there. I think overall, both markets are showing extreme demand to be in the city center, either by extreme crowding, by living underground. I think I had shown earlier, I didn't, images of people, some in Hong Kong, a whole market on rooftops. People are trying to eke out space where they can in the center city. And the challenge, of course, will be that that's the highest valued land, so how would we reserve space for affordable housing? And as I live in some of these cities, I think we can be more creative. It's partly an urban design issue, working with the interstitial spaces, working with spaces we've got about what's possible. So you could see online, some architects have done projects on underground spaces of different kinds of uses, how well it could be designed, et cetera. Because in a sense, they already had building codes for human habitation underground. So if it could be a design issue. I think alongside that, we have to rethink how we're visioning the future city and what it's going to look like. How crowded it actually is, and so therefore how will we share spaces, right? A lot of the visioning, again, seems to be coming from manuals from the 1970s when it was a lot less crowded in the cities, right? They both show the need for rental housing. Neither public policy nor formal markets serve this need, and so these millions of people, other markets have come up to serve that demand. And the need for life cycle housing, that these are not static needs, when you're single versus when you're a couple versus when you're a family with kids. There's also in Asia, when people go to the hospital, they don't feed you. You have to have someone come with you, and they need to be somewhere near the hospital. So there's some of the underground housing was specifically geared towards those kinds of needs for 2-3 months right near the hospital. There's a variety of housing needs that are needed by different people's situations. So there isn't this one affordable housing solution, but we need a variety of options, a variety of places in this city. And then overall, encapsulating both urban expansion and housing, what these studies together are doing is putting emphasis on migrants in the city and what some people call informal. I don't like it so to use informal as much, so I'm calling it semi-formal, which sounds like you're going to a party or something. But what I mean is that there's big gray area. So I said for decades the official policy was to have underground housing, right? So and there's different kinds of formal employment that some of these people might be engaged in. Another thing that both the different studies together show is we can be more resourceful in recovering data about these people who are already in the city because they're physically there, and we can use their material appearance as well as the market that is serving them. And finally, I think what these three studies have in common is advocating for working with and learning from what their revealed preferences are showing. They're already making some hard trade-offs about where to be in the city, what kind of conditions they're living with, what are the priorities, because we're going to have to make some hard trade-offs going forward for our urban future. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk.